So in the book, you discuss this way of looking at the hierarchy of life. If you're talking about life as kind of that which moves itself, that which has an interior animating principle, then is it possible to talk about kind of higher or more developed forms of that principle?
Yes, it is. And so St. Thomas has in his Summa Contra Gentiles, book 4, number 11, he has what I would call a natural analog to the liturgy. In other words, a natural, he sees in nature a philosophical basis for our liturgy. And actually, if you, and you sort of miss it in some of the summas, and the reason is because he changes the terminology somewhat from the church fathers. And so if you read his commentary on Dionysius the Areopagite, who's one of the great Eastern thinkers, in the section where Dionysius is talking about the liturgical structure and how the universe is, is fit into this, so to speak, St. Thomas starts commenting on this, and he sets out very explicitly. He says, I'll sort of paraphrase him. He says, "I agree with this 100%. The universe of creatures is set up according to such and such and such," and he follows right down along with Dionysius, and he changes the terms from more theological terms to philosophical terms, and then he goes into his summas and he uses those philosophical terms when he's talking about the structure of the angelic universe and the structure of the human universe, and so you miss the fact that he's talking about a liturgical structure, and so to answer your question, he basically sees in things what he calls degrees of imminence. And so ultimately, for instance, intelligence is an interior operation. You think, interiorly. And so it's the degree that something, particularly the action of something, ends in an interior resting, so to speak. And so, for instance, we can talk about like a billiard ball. A billiard ball sits there by itself, and until another billiard ball rolls into it. We've all, most of us have played pool before, and so the action comes from the outside, hits the billiard ball, and passes to the billiard ball that it hits, and then it rolls to another position. So it rolls to another external position. So a plant does something intrinsically different. So your first level of life, the plant is dependent on things exterior to it. And so it draws in the CO2 and sunlight and certain inorganic molecules, and then it draws these inside and fundamentally changes them into something living. Now, the product ultimately is that which is exterior to it. So it produces a flower and then a fruit and then its offspring. But nevertheless, there is an interiorization of that action, and the interiorization of the action is very critical because it fundamentally transforms these things that it gets from the outside and radically alters them into a living thing. Another offspring, another seed of itself. And then we move on up to the animals, which have that same reproductive and growth power, but the hallmark of animality is sensing. And so when you sense something, animals can remember things. So we have a dog remembers this every day, and so when you come home, and so the dog has, while it's dependent on things outside of itself, the action, the learning of the outside stops interiorly, and it becomes an interior action. The dog has a memory. And so animals have memories, and they have an interior sense of memory. And then humans, the next up from that, this interiorization gets more and more intensified. So we learn from things outside of us, but then we can start thinking about things, musing interiorly on things, and we form a concept of self which arises purely interiorly. And so we form the idea of intellectually another self. And then we move on up to angels beyond that, and angels are sort of given ideas by God, and so they don't depend on anything outside of themselves for their knowledge. And they're given ideas from God, and they can immediately know things based on that. And then we have God who his own being is his knowledge. The idea that he understands himself completely, and by understanding himself, he understands everything else. So he doesn't depend on anything outside of himself. And so it's this increased degree of interior intensification of interior actions, particularly as the way they terminate or rest. They get more and more interiorized in the final part of their action. And so that's what he was looking at, and that actually fits a liturgical idea very well, what the fathers would call the three parts of the liturgy. And so there's three generic parts that they had, which they called the first part was what in the terms what we use from mystical theology for the spiritual life, and this is where the idea of deification gets back into it. So the first part of the liturgy goes to the reading of the scripture, and so they call that purgation. So you go into church, you sit down, they read the readings, and you're sort of moved away from concerns about the world, and you're sort of drawn up into God by the readings, and that's called purging you from that which is that which is not God. And then you move from that to the Nicene Creed, which expresses the faith, and then the consecration, and they call that illumination, just like Christ at Emmaus. They with the disciples after the resurrection, he consecrated the bread and wine and became the body and blood, and then he disappeared from their sight. And so there's an idea of illumination. And then moving beyond that, we start calling God, we're drawn up from that into deification, where we call God our Father, and then we actually unite in communion with God, and that's called union. And so these three stages mimic very well actually the hierarchy that we see. So plants are sort of purging, the fathers would say plants are sort of, and St. Thomas, he calls it cause or order. The plants are being ordered, living things are being ordered, or matter, inorganic, non-living matter is being ordered away from itself to something higher to become living. So the plants are taking organic things and making them living. And then animals have basic sensory knowledge. It is a type of knowledge, so it is a type of illumination. They do know something. And then humans, in a sense, we have all of those powers in us. We can grow and reproduce. We have the powers of plant. We can sense like an animal, that we're able to think. So we unite things together in ourselves. So we represent union. We draw everything in the material universe together. And then we also draw the spiritual universe together as well. So we're sort of a tie between the whole thing. And so that's sort of the liturgical structure that we see in the material universe.
It's true to say then that not just that different beings possess different types of life, but that one is more alive, strictly speaking, than another.
Right. The idea is the higher up you go, the more alive it is. And so from a philosophical standpoint, the more, and it's kind of a loaded word to use nowadays because people have the wrong connotation because of the way they're educated. But the more intellect something is, and we tend to equate intellect with a computer idea, which is in the modern world, and that's not the way the ancients and the medievals used it. And so, but setting that aside for the moment and just sticking with what they said, the more intellectual something is, the more it is alive, the more dynamic it is. God being, from a philosophical standpoint, infinite intelligence or something. So the more it, because intelligence is an interiorized thing. It's an interior dynamism when you're thinking, and so the more interior something is, the more it is alive. And that is our experience. You can see a rock or something and it sits there and does nothing, and you don't call a rock a living thing. And yourself, and you initiate actions, you do things for yourself, and so these arise from your interior motivation, interior stimulus. And so the more interior something is, the more it is alive, the more intensely alive it is.